You were told it was about oil, that every gas price spike, every Middle East war, every economic shock was just part of a natural cycle. Supply, demand, geopolitics. But that's a lie. The truth is far darker. In 1974, the United States made a pact not to protect oil, but to protect the dollar. A quiet arrangement with Saudi Arabia ensured that every barrel of oil sold worldwide would be priced in US dollars, locking the global economy into a system of artificial demand. For 50 years, this invisible contract has propped up America's financial supremacy, created artificial stability, and funded wars without consequence. But now that system is fracturing. Nations are buying oil in yuan and rupees. And the petrodollar, the core pillar of American dominance, is showing cracks. This isn't just a story about currency. It's a story about control and what happens when that control slips. In the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, the United States faced a terrifying possibility: skyrocketing inflation, collapsing trade balances, and a weakened global role for the dollar. But instead of solving the energy problem, Washington solved a monetary. In 1974, under immense geopolitical pressure, the U.S. struck a secretive deal with Saudi Arabia, the dominant voice in OPEC. In exchange for military protection, arms deals, and political support, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars and recycle those dollars into American assets. That deal did more than stabilize oil prices. It transformed the dollar into the bloodline of global trade. Suddenly, every country that needed oil also needed dollars. Every central bank stockpiled them. Every international loan defaulted to them. The petrodollar became the hidden engine of American hegemony. And yet, the average American never knew. The pact was never voted on. It never passed through Congress. It didn't need to. It worked because it was invisible. Because every time the world needed oil, it had to bow, not to OPEC, but to the U.S. financial system. The dollar was now backed not by gold, not by productivity, but by oil flows and military leverage. Wars could be fought and financed without tax hikes. Debt could balloon without collapsing the system. It was an empire sustained by energy dependency, not territorial conquest. But the world is changing. China is buying oil from the Gulf in yuan. India is paying in rupees. Even Saudi Arabia is signaling flexibility. These shifts may seem small, but they chip away at a system that was never built to withstand competition. And once the dollar is no longer needed for oil, the illusion breaks. Prices don't just go up. The entire foundation of American global power starts to shake. The petrodollar system didn't just emerge, it was engineered. In the early 1970s, the U.S. economy was reeling. The gold standard had collapsed, inflation was rising, and the Vietnam War had drained both treasury and trust. Nixon's decision to decouple the dollar from gold in 1971 had created a dangerous vacuum. Without gold, what would give the dollar its value? The answer came not from Wall Street, but from Riyadh. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon orchestrated a pivotal agreement with the House of Saudade. The premise was simple, but world-changing. The U.S. would provide military protection and elite weaponry, and in return, Saudi Arabia would ensure that oil, the most traded commodity on earth, would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. Not only that, but Saudi Arabia would reinvest its vast oil profits into U.S. Treasury securities and assets, effectively financing American deficits. This pact birthed the petrodollar, a system that subtly coerced every nation on earth into holding dollars if they wanted energy. Oil importing countries had to acquire dollars first, creating perpetual demand. Oil exporting nations, flush with dollar reserves, would reinvest in U.S. markets to avoid devaluation. It was a perfect loop, an elegant trap. This mechanism allowed the U.S. to run trade deficits without consequence. While other nations needed to export to earn dollars, America could simply print them. It gave Washington geopolitical leverage, allowing it to sanction, isolate, or reward nations based on their compliance with dollar norms. It turned the Federal Reserve into the central bank of the world. More than that, it created a false sense of prosperity at home. Americans could consume beyond their means, import cheap goods, and fund an ever-expanding defense budget, all without experiencing the full cost of inflation or austerity. The petrodollar was a silent subsidy, not just to Wall Street, but to the American way of life. But this system came at a price. It chained U.S. foreign policy to authoritarian regimes, prioritized oil-rich allies over democratic values, and entangled military strategy with monetary preservation. From Iraq to Libya, conflicts were often justified through the lens of security or human rights. But beneath the surface was a recurring pattern: oil and the currencies used to trade it. Saddam Hussein threatened to sell oil in euros. Gaddafi proposed the Pan-African gold dinar. Both were eliminated. These aren't conspiracy theories. They are inconvenient truths embedded in cables, reports, and classified memos. The petrodollar didn't just shape markets, it shaped wars. Today, that system is under threat. For the first time in 50 years, countries are bypassing the dollar. China has signed long-term oil contracts with Saudi Arabia and Iran denominated in yuan. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. The BRICS alliance is exploring a new payment system altogether, potentially backed by a basket of commodities. And even America's closest allies are hedging, quietly diversifying their reserves, reducing dollar exposure, and preparing for a post-petrodollar world. Saudi Arabia's recent signals about accepting non-dollar payments may seem symbolic, but in a system built entirely on perception, symbols are everything. The illusion of dollar indispensability is beginning to crack. This shift has profound consequences. The dollar's global dominance has allowed the U.S. to suppress interest rates, export inflation, and maintain strategic control over financial choke points. Without that privilege, the economic landscape changes overnight. Higher borrowing costs, reduced foreign demand for U.S. debt, and a shrinking geopolitical influence all follow. Domestically, this means tighter credit, volatile markets, and potential stagflation, inflation combined with economic stagnation. And globally, it means power redistribution. If oil no longer flows through the dollar, the currency becomes just another fiat, not the axis of the financial universe, but one of many orbiting players. Some dismiss these developments as marginal. They say the dollar is still used in over 80% of global trade settlements, that no other currency can match its liquidity, that trust in the U.S. system remains unshaken. But these are the same arguments used to defend the British pound a century ago. Hegemonies don't collapse overnight. They decay in plain sight, eroded by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not about sudden replacement. It's about gradual irrelevance. About a world where countries have options and fewer reasons to obey Washington's rules. And yet, this conversation rarely reaches the public. Most Americans don't know why the dollar matters beyond their wallets. They don't connect the dots between a Saudi oil shipment and a Fed rate hike. They see gas prices rise and blame presidents, not petrodollar fragility. But understanding the system is key to understanding modern geopolitics. The petrodollar is not a relic. It's the scaffolding holding up an empire. And when that scaffolding begins to wobble, everything it supported becomes unstable. The military budgets, the stock market highs, the consumer credit booms, all of it rests on a promise made in 1974, whispered behind closed doors, never voted on, but enforced through power, through war, and through fear. We are entering a new era, one where multipolarity isn't theoretical, it's transactional. Where oil can be bought in yuan, settlements cleared in rupees, reserves held in gold or digital assets. The U.S. may still dominate, but it must now compete. And for a system built on assumed loyalty, that shift is existential. The petrodollar was never about oil. It was about control. And control, once lost, is rarely regained without cost. For decades, the petrodollar gave the United States an invisible advantage, not just in economics, but in empire. It allowed Washington to print debt without fear, to spend without consequence, and to influence global events with the push of a button. But empires built on invisible foundations eventually face visible consequences. And today, those consequences are accelerating. The cracks are no longer theoretical. They're showing up in trade settlements, in central bank reserves, and most painfully, in the wallets of ordinary Americans. Because the petrodollar wasn't just a foreign policy tool. It was a shield that kept inflation low, interest rates suppressed, and demand for U.S. debt artificially high. Without that shield, the U.S. economy becomes exposed to the very forces it once exported. Take gas prices. Most Americans believe they're driven by simple supply and demand. But that's only part of the story. The real driver is the strength of the dollar in global oil markets. As long as oil was priced exclusively in dollars, the U.S. could print money, run deficits, and still import cheap energy. But when countries begin settling oil in other currencies, the demand for dollars drops. That means more dollars chasing fewer goods, a perfect recipe for inflation. Worse, it means foreign nations have less incentive to recycle their dollar earnings into U.S. assets. They start selling treasuries. Yields rise. The cost of borrowing explodes. Suddenly, that $34 trillion debt isn't just a number, it's a national vulnerability. And the geopolitical consequences are just as sharp. The U.S. once held leverage over allies and enemies alike through control of the financial system. Countries that misbehaved could be locked out of SWIFT, sanctioned, or frozen. But in a post-petrodollar world, those tools become weaker. If oil can be bought in yuan and reserves held in gold, then the U.S. no longer holds the keys. Nations begin hedging, forming alternative alliances, and designing parallel systems. The result is an immediate collapse. It's fragmentation. A slow erosion of centralized power into regional blocs, each with their own financial rules and settlement mechanisms. It's the beginning of multipolar finance and the end of dollar unipolarity. None of this means the dollar will disappear. It still holds advantages in liquidity, trust, and global inertia. But power isn't just about what exists, it's about what's shifting. And the shift is undeniable. From China's oil for yuan deals to India's rupee settlements with Russia, to Brazil and Argentina exploring bilateral currencies, the trend is clear. The monopoly is ending, and with it, the privileges that Americans have taken for granted are beginning to unwind. The ability to import without exporting, to fund wars without political backlash, to inflate without triggering collapse. All of it was built on the petrodollar illusion, and illusions don't survive forever. The real danger is psychological. As the world changes, Washington remains in denial. Policymakers still speak of dollar dominance as if it were a law of nature, not a product of deals and enforcement. They dismiss alternatives as unserious. They treat yuan settlements as noise. But ignoring structural shifts doesn't stop them. It only ensures unpreparedness. Meanwhile, the average American is left confused. Why is everything more expensive? Why does the government keep printing money but nothing gets better? Why do gas prices feel like blackmail every time a missile hits the Middle East? The answer isn't simple, but it starts in 1974, with a deal most people never heard of, that shaped the world they now struggle to understand. This is the moment of reckoning. Not because collapse is imminent, but because the shield is gone. The dollar is no longer untouchable. Oil is no longer exclusive. The empire is no longer invisible. The United States now faces a choice: adapt to a multipolar world, or cling to a fading structure built on control, not cooperation. The petrodollar worked, brilliantly, brutally, silently. But its time is running out, and the bill for 50 years of artificial dominance is finally coming due. The brilliance of the petrodollar was never in its design. It was in its invisibility. It didn't require laws, treaties, or public debates. It required dependency. As long as the world needed oil, and oil was priced in dollars, the U.S. could control the current without owning the pipeline. But what happens when that dependency fades? The answer is unfolding now, and it's not a financial story. It's a geopolitical unraveling. China doesn't need to invade anyone to challenge U.S. supremacy. It just needs to offer oil-rich nations an alternative. The yuan, backed by its vast manufacturing base and now linked to commodities through bilateral trade deals, is becoming that alternative. And with every transaction that bypasses the dollar, the grip loosens. This isn't just about money. It's about leverage. The petrodollar gave Washington the power to sanction, to isolate, to punish. It allowed the U.S. to weaponize access to global finance. But a multipolar currency system weakens that weapon. Countries sanctioned by the U.S. are finding escape valves, trading outside the dollar, building swift alternatives, hoarding gold. The very tools America used to dominate the world are now encouraging others to build systems that exclude it. The irony is painful, but predictable. Every abuse of the dollar's dominance, every unjustified sanction, every financial coercion, made the world more eager to find an exit. Meanwhile, America's domestic economy is absorbing the shock. Cheap imports are no longer guaranteed. Low interest rates can no longer be sustained without artificial demand for U.S. debt. Inflation isn't transitory, it's structural. As the dollar's role in global trade shrinks, so does its cushion. That means more borrowing just to stand still. It means more volatility, more fragility, more exposure. And while the headlines talk about politics, what's really happening is systemic. The scaffolding is shaking, and no one seems willing to admit how deep the cracks run. Even allies are hedging. Saudi Arabia, the very architect of the original petrodollar deal, is now entertaining payments in yuan and local currencies. It's joining BRICS summits. It's coordinating with China on oil infrastructure. This isn't rebellion, it's preparation. The world isn't trying to destroy the dollar. It's trying to survive without it. And that quiet shift, away from loyalty toward leverage, is far more dangerous than any declaration. Because when the world no longer needs your currency, they no longer need your permission. And when that happens, the empire isn't attacked. It simply dissolves. The most dangerous assumption is that this process will be slow. But history shows otherwise. Financial orders often look stable until they aren't. Britain's pound dominated global trade for over a century. Then, within a few decades, it collapsed under the weight of war, debt, and competition. The same vulnerabilities exist today. Massive deficits, military overreach, rising alternatives, a populace unaware of the stakes. The difference is that the British Empire declined in a world of slower capital. Today, digital finance moves in real time. A loss of confidence can cascade in weeks, not years. What happens when the world wakes up and realizes the dollar isn't special anymore? When oil is traded in 5 currencies, not one? When debt can't be sold abroad without higher yields? When the U.S. can no longer fund its wars, its welfare, and its Wall Street with the same magic ink? That's the future no one wants to speak about. But it's coming. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 small trades, one transaction at a time, quietly writing the obituary of the petrodollar age. The collapse of the petrodollar won't look like a dramatic headline. It will look like subtle changes most people barely notice, until it's too late. A few more oil shipments settled in yuan. A few more central banks reducing their dollar reserves. A few more U.S. Treasury auctions with weaker foreign demand. Then one day, the pressure breaks. The bond market wobbles. The dollar weakens sharply. Inflation spikes, not because of supply chains or wars, but because the world no longer needs to hold or recycle dollars like it used to. This is how global monetary systems unravel, slowly at first, then all at once. The U.S. government will likely respond with denial. Officials will blame external enemies, temporary dislocations, or speculative attacks. But beneath the noise, the structural reality remains. For 50 years, the U.S. enjoyed what no empire before it had: the ability to print the world's reserve currency and compel others to use it. That ability was never guaranteed by law. It was enforced by oil dependency and military dominance. Now, both are fading. America still has unmatched military power, but it no longer has unquestioned monetary obedience. That obedience is fracturing, and with it, the very illusion of dollar invincibility. For everyday Americans, this means a painful awakening. Decades of cheap credit, subsidized imports, and global privilege have created a false sense of economic strength. But when the petrodollar structure breaks, the U.S. will face the same pressures other debtor nations face: higher borrowing costs, tighter budgets, and external constraints. The days of limitless spending without consequence will end. And as painful as that will be, it will also expose the truth that the American economy wasn't exceptional. It was advantaged by a geopolitical arrangement now dissolving. The post-petrodollar world won't be apocalyptic, but it would be different. More volatile, more uncertain, more competitive. A world where America must earn what it once received by default. That's the cost of losing control. Not collapse, but constraint. Not fire, but friction. And for a nation that grew used to ease, friction may be the hardest loss of all. The petrodollar was never about oil. It was about empire, invisible, quiet, enforced not by law, but by necessity. For 50 years, the world traded energy for dollars, and in doing so, it traded sovereignty for access. That trade is ending. What rises in its place is not yet clear. A BRICS-led alternative? A return to gold? A basket of digital currencies? Or a fragmented world where no single power dominates? Whatever the outcome, the one certainty is this: the old system is dying. Not because it was defeated, but because it exhausted itself. The real tragedy is that few Americans realize what's being lost. They were never told what was gained. The petrodollar was not taught in schools. It was not debated in elections. It was hidden in trade flows, embedded in foreign policy, disguised as economics. But it shaped everything from gas prices to interest rates, from wars abroad to wealth at home. And now, as it unravels, the silence continues. No sirens, no speeches, just the quiet sound of an empire learning. It is no longer the axis of the world. For the future, there is still choice. America can acknowledge the shift and adapt, or it can resist and fracture. It can lead in a multipolar system, or collapse trying to preserve a monopoly that no longer exists. But it cannot go back. The 1974 pact cannot be revived. The illusion cannot be reforged. The dollar can still survive, but not as it was, not as the untouchable king. It must compete now, in a world it once commanded. This is not the end of the United States, but it may be the end of the American empire. And like all empires, it will not fall in flames, but in silence, retreating one transaction at a time.